Alianna DeFreeze was just 14 when she stepped out into the cold Cleveland morning, and Christopher Whitaker was already watching. In a matter of minutes, their paths would cross in a way that would send shockwaves through an entire city. What began as a routine walk to school would end in one of the most chilling and heartbreaking crimes in recent memory. This is the story of how innocence met evil, and how a single moment changed everything. On a frigid January morning in Cleveland, Ohio, 14-year-old Alianna DeFreeze got ready for school just like she always did. It was January 26, 2017, and the winter air was biting cold. She bundled up in her coat and hoodie, grabbed her backpack, and stepped out of her family's home. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the streets were quiet. Most people were still indoors, waiting for the day to warm. But for Alianna, school started early, and her bus stop was several blocks away at East 93rd Street and Kinsman Road. She was a bright, artistic teenager who loved drawing, listening to music, and spending time with her family. That morning, she walked alone, earbuds in, unaware that this seemingly ordinary day would take a horrifying turn. She never arrived at school. As the hours passed, her family grew increasingly concerned. Alianna was responsible. She wasn't the kind of girl to skip class or disappear without telling anyone. Her mother began calling the school. They said she never showed up. Calls to friends and neighbors offered no answers. Panic began to set in. By the afternoon, her family reported her missing to the police. Officers canvassed the area and checked nearby locations, but there was no sign of her. Flyers were printed with her picture, asking anyone with information to come forward. Volunteers joined the search, walking the route she usually took, hoping to find some clue. But the streets offered no answers. No dropped phone, no backpack, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she had simply vanished into the morning air. What made things more confusing was that this was a high-traffic area. The bus stop was near businesses, homes, and even a church. Someone had to have seen something, but no witnesses came forward. No one reported anything unusual. For a while, it seemed like the city had swallowed Alianna whole. As the first 48 hours ticked by, hope began to dim. Investigators treated it as a missing persons case, but deep down, her loved ones feared something much worse. The situation became even more chilling when authorities reviewed the school's attendance records. It was confirmed. Alianna never made it to school that day, not even close. That left a narrow window between the time she left home and when she should have boarded the bus. Somewhere along that familiar stretch, something had gone terribly wrong. The community held its breath. Rumors began to spread. People whispered about human trafficking, random violence, and strangers lurking in abandoned houses. No theory seemed too far-fetched. Parents began walking their kids to school. Trust was fading. The neighborhood, once familiar and routine, now felt dangerous. As the search expanded, so did the fear. This wasn't just about a missing girl anymore. It was about a sense of safety being ripped away. No one knew where Alianna was. No one knew who could have taken her. But one thing was becoming clear with each passing day. This wasn't just a case of a girl who got lost. This was something far more sinister, something that would soon reveal a darkness no one was prepared to face. As days passed with no sign of Alianna DeFreeze, desperation grew. Investigators began combing through every piece of evidence they could find: surveillance footage, eyewitness tips, and activity logs from nearby businesses. The area surrounding East 93rd Street and Kinsman Road was dotted with corner stores, auto shops, and fast food restaurants, many of which had security cameras pointed toward the street. Detectives hoped that somewhere, in all that grainy footage, they might find a glimpse of the missing girl. And eventually, they did. Footage from a nearby business revealed a chilling moment. At around 7:07 a.m., just minutes after Alianna left home, she was captured walking along the sidewalk near her bus stop. Alone at first, she looked calm, moving at a steady pace. But in the background of the frame, partially obscured, was the shape of a man walking behind her. He kept his distance, never too close, never too far. In another clip from a nearby angle, the two were no longer visible. It was like the street had swallowed them both. Investigators slowed the footage down, frame by frame, trying to identify anything that might lead to the man's identity. His coat had no logos, his face was obscured by a hood, and he kept to the edges of the camera's view. But one thing stood out: his movements. He wasn't just walking, he was following. The man's presence raised the alarm. Detectives scoured other camera angles, expanding their search radius. As they pieced together the timeline, a disturbing pattern formed. Earlier that morning, the same man had been spotted loitering in the area. He was seen pacing near the bus stop and then walking up and down a side street waiting. It didn't look like coincidence. It looked like stalking. Their investigation led them toward a series of abandoned buildings just blocks from where Alianna had last been seen. These properties, boarded up and forgotten, had long been used for illegal activity, squatting, drug use, and more. One in particular caught their attention. The side door had been broken open. Inside, the floor was dusty and littered with trash, but in the back, something felt off. A few boards had been moved. Beneath them were streaks in the dust, drag, marks. Close by, they found a torn piece of fabric and traces of blood. Forensic teams were called in immediately. The house was sealed off, and evidence was carefully collected. DNA was recovered from several surfaces, and a partial shoe print was documented. While it was not yet confirmed that the blood belonged to Alianna, the signs were grim. Investigators were no longer dealing with just a disappearance. The case had turned a corner. Something violent had occurred in that house. As this new evidence emerged, officers widened the search, looking into known offenders in the area. They weren't just hoping to find a missing girl anymore, they were racing against time to catch a predator. And though they didn't yet know his name, they were closer than they realized. The man in the footage was no stranger to violence. He had left a trail before, and now he had done so again. The DNA collected from the abandoned house was swiftly analyzed. Within days, a match came back from the national database. The name tied to it sent a wave of unease through the team of investigators. Christopher Whitaker. He was no stranger to law enforcement. His criminal history stretched back years and included assault and sexual offenses. Despite that, he was walking free, living just miles from where Alianna DeFreeze had disappeared. Investigators began building their case. Alongside the DNA match, other pieces of evidence started falling into place. The partial shoe print found at the scene matched a pair of boots Whitaker was known to wear. His cell phone records placed him near the area at the same time Alianna went missing. Surveillance from another location even showed a figure resembling him walking briskly away from the bus stop shortly after the time Alianna was last seen. Police moved quickly. Whitaker was located and taken into custody. During initial questioning, he denied involvement, claiming he didn't know the girl and had nothing to do with her disappearance. But the evidence was mounting, and behind the scenes, forensic testing continued. The blood found inside the abandoned house was confirmed to be Alianna's. There was no longer any doubt. Something unspeakable had happened to her, and Whitaker was at the center of it. As pressure grew, Whitaker broke. He confessed, but only partially at first. He admitted to being with Alianna that morning and leading her away from the bus stop. The details he gave were vague, riddled with half-truths and evasions. But then he did something unexpected. He agreed to take police to another property, different abandoned house, several blocks away from the first. It was there, he said, that they would find Alianna. When investigators entered the second house, what they found confirmed their worst fears. In a dark, debris-strewn corner of the basement, hidden beneath old furniture and scraps of wood, lay Alianna's body. The condition in which she was found was horrific. She had been bound, assaulted, and murdered in a way that made even seasoned detectives pause. The brutality of the crime was beyond comprehension. It was not a moment of madness or panic. It was deliberate, prolonged, and unimaginably cruel. Whitaker's confession provided chilling insight into what had happened. He had been watching that morning, waiting for someone to isolate. When he saw Alianna walking alone, he followed. He lured her away from the bus stop and forced her into the abandoned home. What followed was hours of violence. He showed no remorse. His voice remained calm as he detailed the events, as though he were recounting something ordinary. The news of Alianna's fate shattered the community. Vigils were held, and flowers piled up outside the school and at the site where she had last been seen. People were heartbroken, horrified, and angry. The man responsible had been walking freely among them, living unnoticed. He had stalked their streets passed by their children, and no one had known the evil that lived behind his eyes. Now everyone knew his name, and justice had begun its course. As Christopher Whitaker sat behind bars, the public began asking hard questions. How could a man with such a violent past have been free to roam the streets? Why hadn't the justice system done more to monitor him? The answers were unsettling. Whitaker had a long criminal history, including charges of sexual assault and violence. Yet despite these red flags, he had managed to slip through gaps in the system, remaining largely unchecked. In the aftermath of Alianna DeFreeze's murder, it became clear that her death was not just the result of one man's evil, it was the result of systemic failure. Digging into his record, journalists and investigators discovered that Whitaker had been convicted in 2005 of aggravated assault and attempted rape. He served time, but was eventually released. There were opportunities to flag him as a high-risk offender, but they were missed. He had violated probation more than once, but enforcement had been inconsistent. There had even been moments when his GPS monitor, part of his parole conditions, had stopped working. No immediate action was taken. Over time, those lapses added up. And then, tragedy struck. Alianna's family, already devastated, had to live with the knowledge that her death might have been preventable. Their pain turned to advocacy. They spoke out about the cracks in the legal system, the lack of resources for monitoring dangerous individuals, and the need for reform. They pushed for stronger laws to ensure that violent offenders couldn't so easily disappear into neighborhoods without anyone watching. In court, Whitaker was formally charged with aggravated murder, rape, kidnapping, and multiple other offenses. Prosecutors decided to seek the death penalty, given the brutal nature of the crime. His defense team entered a guilty plea, hoping to avoid a trial and the possibility of execution. The courtroom was silent as the charges were read. No excuses were offered. No explanations were given. The facts spoke for themselves. What had been done to Alianna was beyond redemption. The sentencing phase brought raw emotion. Alianna's family spoke of her smile, her creativity, her love for music and her siblings. Her mother described the unbearable silence that now filled their home. Her father said no punishment would ever be enough, but they also said they hoped the case would lead to change, that no other family should have to endure the pain they now carried. Whitaker was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never walk free again. But the wounds he left behind would never fully heal. Cleveland's East Side, once just another urban neighborhood, had become the backdrop for one of the city's most heartbreaking tragedies. People locked their doors more tightly. Parents kept closer eyes on their children. The shadows that once passed unnoticed were now sources of fear. In the months that followed, lawmakers proposed new legislation aimed at tracking and monitoring violent offenders more closely. The tragedy had sparked a movement. It had taken the loss of an innocent girl to wake the system up. And while justice had been served, the damage was already done. The system had failed Alianna, but her story would not be forgotten. In the weeks and months after Christopher Whitaker's sentencing, the shock of Alianna DeFreeze's murder continued to settle over the city. Her name was spoken everywhere, in homes, schools, churches, and council chambers. What had happened to her was not just a crime, but a tragedy that exposed a painful truth. Evil could exist in plain sight. People looked at their surroundings differently. They were more cautious, more suspicious, and far more aware that safety was never guaranteed, even in the most ordinary places. Alianna's school placed new safety measures in place. Bus routes were re-evaluated, more security cameras were installed, and students were encouraged never to walk alone. Other schools in Cleveland soon followed, realizing that if something so horrific could happen to one child, it could happen to others. Parents walked their kids to school, waited at bus stops, and made sure their children checked in every morning and afternoon. Trust had been replaced with fear, and a city once used to routine now moved with caution. Community leaders began organizing events in Alianna's honor. Candlelight vigils lit up her neighborhood. Balloons with her favorite colors were released into the sky, and murals were painted in her memory. She was no longer just a missing child or a name in a headline. She became a symbol of what had been lost and of what needed to change. Her family worked with local organizations to advocate for better monitoring of known offenders and improved safety in high-risk neighborhoods. They spoke not just out of grief, but out of determination. If they couldn't bring Alianna back, they could at least make sure her death meant something. One of the most powerful changes to come from the tragedy was the introduction of Alianna's Alert, a proposed piece of legislation aimed at improving the way schools and parents communicate about student absences. Under this policy, if a student doesn't show up to school and no excuse is given, the school must notify the parent immediately. It was a simple measure, but one that could close a dangerous gap. Had that alert existed the day Alianna disappeared, someone might have realized she was missing even sooner. Perhaps it wouldn't have saved her, but it could save others. As time went on, the memory of what happened remained etched in the minds of those who lived through it. For some, it brought about fear that lingered long after the headlines faded. For others, it created a sense of purpose. Neighborhood watches became more active. Abandoned buildings were boarded up and monitored. Conversations about violence, justice, and prevention became louder, more urgent, more focused. Alianna's story was no longer just about loss. It had become a force for change. Yet, despite the efforts, nothing could erase what had happened. The evil that took her left scars too deep to heal completely. It reminded everyone that monsters don't always hide in the dark. Sometimes they walk in daylight unnoticed until it's too late. Alianna DeFreeze's life ended far too soon, stolen by someone who never should have had the chance. But in her absence, she left behind a legacy, one that continues to echo in every effort to make communities safer, and every vow that no other child will be forgotten.